Please help me in welcoming Dr. Nathan Kalmoe to University of Michigan. Back to University of Michigan.
Thank you, Eric, and thanks to Sandy and ICPSR for organizing this great event and for inviting me. It's an honor to be here and to participate, especially with such great scholars and friends, and to share the stage with Hakeem this evening. And thank you all for being here as well this evening. My talk today is a collaboration with Kim Gross, and we're about to send this off for review for the first time after a couple of revisions, so your input is going to be really helpful. Our project is broadly focused on how group attitudes and identities are influencing people's attitudes towards the parties, and how election news shapes people's perceptions of the same. So I'm going to start by talking about just a brief review of group centrism, of horse race news, and the sliver that we're interested for this talk. I'm going to give you a content analysis of newspaper coverage of how the parties are discussed in terms of the different groups that make up the coalitions that vote for those parties as represented in the news over about 2 decades. And then we're going to look at 3 survey experiments that show the consequences of this kind of framing of electoral coalitions by race as well as a little bit by sex. I'll wrap up with some implications and then take your questions. I'm contractually obligated to start with Phil Converse. In the 1950s and early 1960s, he had the keen insight and provided the evidence to back it up that when people think about politics, when they're asked about how they think about parties and candidates, they don't tend to think very much in terms of abstract ideologies or principles. They're much more likely to think in terms of prominent social groups, how they feel about those groups, and how those groups interact with the political parties. That was true in the 1950s when they first presented this evidence. That's true ever since, all the way up to the present. So the reference groups and the identities that are tied into those social groups are key for how people think about politics and the parties. Work that's just being published this month by Aller and Sood shows that the perceptions of the parties make a big difference for how people think and feel about the parties. In particular, people tend to overestimate the percentage of party stereotypical groups that are usually associated with the parties when they are asked what portion of each party coalition is comprised of this group or that group across a number of demographic and other kinds of factors. And the people who overestimate these populations within each party tend to be more attached to the party that they identify with. They tend to have more negative views of the opposing party, and they tend to think that the other party is more extreme. So these attitudes about social groups and the proportions that they serve in advancing the cause of each party are important for these attitudes towards parties. Switching gears a little bit, we're interested in how those groups are represented in election news. We're particularly interested in what's called horse race news, which is news about who is ahead in an election or who's falling behind, how that's changing over the course of the campaign, and what tactics or strategies of the campaigns are responsible for that. And this tends to be the majority of the news coverage that we get. A lot of people complain about this, both elites, normative theorists, as well as the public say, we don't think this is good for democracy. We think we need more issue coverage. We need more candidate coverage. Learn more about the substance of our decisions. But when push comes to shove and people have an opportunity to choose between substantive coverage versus this horse race coverage, they gravitate towards the horse race coverage. It's because it's more exciting and interesting to read about, especially on a day-to-day basis. It's a lot easier to digest, too, than some of the complexities of issues and ideologies that people don't usually want to deal much with. So this is content that draws audiences, and newspapers and television news like this because they have to sell advertisements, and the more eyeballs that they have on the screen or on the page, the more that they can charge. And so they have those benefits. Not only are they covering this more often, they tend to actually pick out the polling results that emphasize the excitement of the conflict, the electoral conflict. My colleague Katie Searles and her colleagues show that systematically news tends to pick out an unrepresentative sample of the polling results that are out there to try to spin an even more interesting narrative. And so that's an interesting dynamic here. Kim and I are interested in group-focused horse race coverage, so not what percent supports this candidate or that candidate overall, but how do different demographic groups, particularly by race and by sex, distribute their support within those polling results or as a general characterization of support for the parties and the candidates. This can be both in terms of a specific election, or it can be broader trends over years or decades and how these coalitions are changing over time. Okay, we have two different ways that we think that are equivalent or maybe just plausible that news could represent these groups within each party coalition. The first we call the party coalition frame. This is 2016 election results from the exit polls. We see that among Clinton's voters, 21% were African American. Okay? So about a little over a fifth of her votes came from black voters. A different way to represent black voting in 2016 is to go the other direction, to choose a different denominator and look at what portion of black voters cast their ballots for Hillary Clinton. And it's 92% in this case. Okay? That's a much different number, even though it's representing the same electorate. And we think the fact that that number is big and the fact that people are not particularly good at thinking about numbers matters for these representations. This big number makes the Democratic Party seem maybe a lot more racialized than the smaller number in which black voters are just one of several groups, including a majority of whites who are supporting, making up the votes that are being cast for the Democratic Party. Okay, so two different ways to think about framing group support. So our questions, we think that this coverage of how groups map their support and how that's represented by journalists can matter for how people are thinking about who is comprising the coalitions for these parties, and their attitudes about those groups who are part of those coalitions are going to then map onto how they think about the parties. So our first question is, how often do we see this kind of news coverage? Not just giving the latest poll results, but breaking it down by different racial and ethnic groups in particular, and which frames are they using? Are they using that big number frame, or are they using the smaller number frame when they talk about these groups? And then secondly, to the extent that we see this kind of coverage, how much is it, in what ways is it influencing people's attitudes towards the parties? So I'm going to start with some content analysis. We use LexisNexis and some search terms I'm happy to show you in the Q&A if you'd like, to try to identify a universe of all of the stories that did sort of horse race style or polling results during presidential elections between 2000 and 2016 in the 5 months leading up to the election, just in the presidential years. We looked for convenience just at front page articles, and then we use additional search terms to focus on race and ethnicity to try to pick out what portion of those horse race and polling stories were focused on these groups within the coalition. And then once we had those stories, we picked out and coded by hand which frames, the big number frame, the minority emphasis that we call it, or the party coalition frame. We looked in New York Times, USA Today, and Washington Post to get a snapshot of important national newspapers, but also ones that are highly influential that change how other news organizations cover these stories as well. This is small numbers. I just want to give you a sense that across all of these years and across all of these newspapers, there are a lot of horse race stories, and a large percent of those stories are talking about different subgroups to break out that representation. Here's a much easier way to look at this. From 2000 until 2016, you see similar trends across all three newspapers. Even as USA Today is doing a lot less of this coverage, more popular focus. Overall, you see a range from about a third to 2/3 of all horse race and polling election news is doing this subgroup analysis of how different groups focused on race and ethnicity are casting their ballots or planning to. When we break this down within that category to see the distribution of the different frames that are used to describe these groups and their support. The minority frame, the minority emphasis, is the predominant one. Sometimes that is done, there we go. Sometimes that is done with specific polling numbers. Other times it's a general characterization saying, for instance, blacks disproportionately cast their ballots for Democrats would fall into that category. Okay? In comparison, the party coalition focus is relatively rare. And then a slightly larger set of stories do a combination of both, which is an interesting mix. So the overall takeaway here is that there are a lot of stories that do this subgroup analysis across the electorate, and when they do that, they tend to gravitate towards that big number frame representing how voters of color cast their ballots. Okay, so we have that baseline. This is happening a lot out in the world. What are the consequences for people's attitudes towards the parties and their candidates? On the one hand, the priming literature might suggest that any mention of these racial and ethnic groups could activate group attitudes, and that could color how people evaluate the parties. We lean, as we've hinted already, towards the idea that the minority frame is going to be an even stronger kind of impact on these attitudes because of that numeracy difference. So our expectation is that people with more racially prejudiced attitudes are going to be more favorable for Republicans when they get this minority emphasis frame in response. This intersects with the priming literature that many of you are probably familiar with, the idea that both explicit and implicit words and images that are associated with race and ethnicity activate people's group attitudes, and that by activating those attitudes have a stronger influence on the subsequent political judgments. In the modern context, as I've said, obviously Republicans are associated with more racial conservatism in terms of policies and higher levels of racial prejudice on average than Democrats. There's question about whether this racial priming is still taking place. Valentino and Neuner have some really interesting publication showing that null results basically for attempts to replicate the racial priming in the current context because of the extent to which politics is already racialized. Okay. A different way to think about this that we think is maybe more plausible and fits with this skepticism about contemporary racial priming is the idea that people might be learning new information rather than just having their attitudes primed as a result, and that new information changes their perceptions of the composition of the parties. So Gabe Lenz, in a different context, was contrasting priming and learning mechanisms for other kinds of news evaluations. And so I'm making use of that distinction in this case. Okay. So the first experiment that we conducted was in spring of 2013, and we framed it as a news article focused essentially the day after the 2012 election is the context that we presented. We had a two-wave panel through SSI with just under 300 white participants, and there was a week between the two waves. We did this two-wave approach because we wanted to ask racial resentment, the racial attitude, in the first wave to not have to worry about potentially priming it by asking it at the beginning just before the treatments so that we could avoid that if that was part of the mechanism. The outcomes we look at are party and candidate evaluations of various sorts. And we used 4 different treatments that we randomized in this experiment. We have, on the one hand, the minority emphasis frame, the party coalition frame, a neutral regional frame, talking about which regions were toss-up versus strong for one party or the other, and a white party frame, which is essentially the flip of the party coalition for Democrats. This is the party coalition of Republicans is more than 90% white among their voters. So that's sort of the flip side of that. This is what the treatments look like. I want to draw your attention first to the text that you can't read. The party frame, the party coalition frame, talked about how 57% of Obama's voters were white, 24% black, and 14% Latino. The minority emphasis frame talks about 93% of black voters casting their ballot for Obama, Latino voters at 71%, and just 39% of white voters. you'll notice other things that are different besides those denominators, and experiment 2 addresses those considerations. We wanted to hit people hard with these different kinds of frames. So the party frame talks about Obama's multiracial coalition. It even shows a white woman and a woman of color hugging, unity and togetherness. So that's obviously doing more than just giving people different numbers. On the other hand, the imagery and the text over here, minority support is key, essentially saying Obama won because of voters of color and showing black voters celebrating his victory. Okay? The white frame talks about Romney's inability to get beyond white voters in his base, with the flip of those percentages for his coalition, and the neutral regional control or reference condition is there as well. Okay. Here we are estimating OLS models of both difference measures between the party evaluations and each of their components. We've got racial resentment from 0 to 1. Everything is coded 0 to 1 for the constituent parts, so the difference measures are -1 to +1. Racial resentment is there for that comparison condition. We've got each of the treatment conditions with the regional neutral condition as the comparison condition, and then interactions with each of the frames and the racial resentment here. What we're looking for is the extent to which the impact of racial resentment is getting larger for people in some frames and not in others. Okay? And that's what we see in the minority frame. You see significant or marginally significant moves, especially for evaluations of Republicans becoming more positive among racially resentful whites when they get the minority emphasis frame compared to all of the other frames. And on the other hand, evaluations of President Obama become significantly more negative as racially resentful whites are exposed to the minority frame versus these others. Okay, so this is preliminary evidence in support of the idea that the way that news is covering these coalitions matters for how people evaluate the parties and how their racial attitudes impact that evaluation. For the second experiment, the key thing that we wanted to do was pull out all of those multiple things that were varying across the different experimental conditions and isolate just the numbers for the party coalition and the minority frame, kind of get rid of the other stuff. So it was conducted in the 2016 CCES study, which is nationally representative. This experiment was in wave 1 of that study with 729 whites just before the election. Same moderator, same basic outcomes. In this case, we had 3 randomized treatments: the minority frame, the party coalition frame, and then the neutral region frame. This is what those look like. Experimentalists among you will be happy to see the images are the same across the 2 different frames that are race-oriented. Here, the minority emphasis frame is just the numbers in the text. The party frame is just the numbers in the text. And then they have the same picture of voters of color with, exchanging the I voted sticker. I was kind of proud that I found, for the neutral condition, the same sticker, just to make sure that there wasn't something about the sticker that was different. Anyways, looking here at similar model setup in 2016, we see similar kind of responsiveness for evaluations of Republicans, but we don't see the same kinds of evaluations transferring over to Donald Trump or Hillary Clinton in this case. So that's something that's different across these 2 studies that we don't have a good explanation for about why sometimes it seems to show up and sometimes it doesn't. Okay, there's other things that were interesting about 2016, as you probably noticed. First, major party, a female nominee for president. And a lot of the dialogue and the news coverage around this election focused on the question of how will women respond to Hillary Clinton's candidacy. Will they be more likely to support her than a generic Democrat because of her sex? If you take a look at the exit poll results, you see, maybe as some of these pundits expected, that women were disproportionately likely to support Clinton overall over Trump. On the other hand, men were more likely to support Trump over Clinton, and so that seems at least consistent with the idea that that the female candidate would be getting more support, although this isn't that much different from other years in terms of generic other Democrats. As you have probably heard before, things change pretty dramatically when you break out women's votes by race. So white women were substantially more likely to vote for Trump over Clinton. Women of color were substantially more likely, by an even greater extent, to vote for Clinton over Trump. And so we think that the representations of how women are voting, whether it's just lumping all women together or distinguishing women by important traits like race, makes a big difference in terms of the kind of perspective that you take away from these news reports. Broadly speaking, we think if news reports are just focusing attention on women overall, this is going to bring to mind ideas of sex as an identity and as reference groups. We might see differences between men and women, or attitudes towards men and women affecting how people respond. On the other hand, if race is being broken out separately for men and women, our expectation is that race as a politicized identity is going to be a more powerful factor in that distinction than sex. And therefore, we'll see differences by racial attitudes when we compare the one condition to the other. Okay, so the third study is in the second wave of the CCES. Now there were only 581 white folks left in the study. I don't know what happened to the other ones. This was after the election. I hope they're okay, I guess. Similar moderator, similar outcomes. There were 4 treatments in this. I'll get to the other 2 in a second. I want to focus just for a minute on the 2 that are relevant here. I'm talking about men and women overall and their support for the Democratic Party versus breaking out by race for women in particular. All right. Here are the treatments. This is just the women and men overall in their support for Democrats. This is the key box breaking out by race and seeing those big differences that we talked about. And here you can see those differences were true in 2012 as well as the 2016 election. Estimating a similar model, this time we only have the 2 treatment conditions, so it's a little bit simpler. No responsiveness in the party evaluations, but we do see racial resentment being a more powerful factor in predicting Trump and Clinton evaluations, which is an interesting contrast from the first election wave in study 2. Breaking this out separately, these are marginal effects plots. With the 2 constituent parts of that difference measure, you see it's really not so much responsiveness to Trump, it's really responsiveness to Clinton's favorability when people get the race and sex information on how people voted in 2012. So in other words, we see that racially resentful whites, when they are told the racial breakdown of women's votes and beyond just women's votes, become significantly more negative towards Clinton in their evaluations. On the flip side, more racially liberal whites are responding more favorably when they get that racialized information. Okay. The other 2 treatments in this study were building out this exploration of representations of sex in the 2016 election. So we have our same old regional emphasis as a neutral condition, and we have another flip condition talking about the extent to which men are an important part of the Republican coalition instead of how women are an important part of the Democratic coalition. Okay. So how are men and women responding to this information? Now I'm just going to look at differences by sex across each of the outcomes that we have in Wave 2. You don't see much in terms of the men favoring and disproportionately making up a Republican coalition. You don't see much in terms of net effects for the sex and race information about voting, but you do see that the treatment that talks about women being a key portion overall of the Democratic coalition leads to some significant differences. in a polarization between men and women, such that women become more negative towards Republicans relative to Democrats, and men become more positive to Republicans relative to Democrats when they hear about how women are a key part of the Democratic Party. And strongest for the thermometer differences, favorability, not as much except for men for the Republican item, and a little bit on the candidate differences as well. Okay. So what do we see here in these studies? First, that racialized horse race news is quite common, and that when news is presenting that information about the coalitions behind each party and each candidate, they're much more likely to go with that big number frame that emphasizes the extent to which, for instance, the Democratic Party has a lot of support from communities of color. When they use that frame in particular, it's especially powerful in activating racial attitudes towards the parties and candidates, but I don't want to overstate the strength of that evidence. You saw a number of cases where items didn't respond in that consistent fashion, and so that's a puzzle that we're still going to be wrestling with. And then finally, we saw right at the end polarization by sex from information about women's overall support for the Democratic Party and their key role in it. For the big picture, we think that this has implications for how news covers elections, the kinds of things that they want to emphasize or de-emphasize, and how people who are evaluating the parties and the candidates are making their choices. That the choice of which frame to use and whether to break out subgroup analysis or not matters for people's attitudes. We also think that this speaks more broadly to the ways in which the national population is diversifying, and that means that the Democratic Party is comprised to a greater and greater extent of voters of color, and that as the Democratic Party becomes more racialized in public perceptions, that these studies speak to that broader dynamic and how white reaction against a diversifying country has implications for support for the Democratic Party. Thank you very much.